Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this week's episode of the PETHS Alumni Network podcast. I'm your host, Nathan, and today we have a very special guest, Mr. Wesley Ng. How are you doing?
Good, Nathan. How are you, man?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the podcast. We know you've been traveling. You said you just got back into town this week. So without any further ado, we'll give you a bit of an intro. You graduated from PET in 2015. We talked a little bit offline. We hosted Gary and Justin on the podcast before. You were in the same graduating class as them. You then went to York to study kinesiology. And then more recently, you graduated from Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK with a Master's of Physio. So jumping straight into it, we talked a little bit offline. You were both in music, you were in sports. Do you have any other like standout moments for you in high school?
I think high school, for me, it was just I did love playing rugby in grade 12. Right, we started this. Well, I say we, but like it was just this group of people started this club, where we were like, hey, I'll sign up to do this, and I was just like, I've never played rugby before. I was like, why not, type of thing. Ended up being a lot of fun, just learning a new thing, learning sort of different ways to move and different like strategies. And really, I think that was one of the things that I kind of look back on and be like, oh yeah, that was a good time to be just like with the boys, with the lads type of thing.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
but yeah, I think other things is just like, yeah, to be honest, I think I gained more from the university experiences than I did high school. I'll be completely honest with that. I liked high
mhm.
school. I loved it. But yeah, that's my two
Right.
cents.
Yeah, I like how you talked about, community, especially on this page. So it sounds like you were always into sports, and a lot of the time when I interview people, they love sports. They go into kinesiology, for example. Is that kind of how things progressed for you?
Yeah, I think so. To be honest, I'm not completely sure why I went initially into kinesiology. I know it was York University marketed as kinesiology and health science, and I was like, well, I've taken all my sciences, like the Asian six pack, and then I was just like, well, health science sounds good, and I like sports, so movement, like basically exercise science. And I was just like, all right, like this sounds like a cool opportunity, like potential good foundation for other like sort of if I wanted to do more school type of thing, which I ended up doing. But I think initially that was my thoughts. It's health science and kinesiology. I was like more attracted towards the kinesiology, but also like the amount of options you might be able to get from having a health science degree.
So you talked a lot about, the so-called Asian six pack. Did you have any classes outside of that you particularly enjoyed that kind of steered you in one direction?
Hmm. I What did I do? I did yeah, like it was called exercise science um in high school. Now I'm remembering it now. So I took the six sciences and I took a seventh, essentially, or like three sciences, three maths, and then I took a seventh science. Um, and yeah, that one was really interesting. I don't remember much from it other than I think it was Miss Wong. I think it was the volleyball was it the volleyball coach.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then they revamped it to call it kinesiology. I think the years afterwards.
Hmm.
Um, and it just I don't know. I guess that was maybe what sort of led me towards pursuing it further a bit as well.
So you mentioned, the kinesiology part at York versus the health science part at York. Is it fair to say that like the kinesiology is more so like the function of the body and like the joints, things like that, whereas health science is more like we talked a little bit offline about the psychology of well-being and being active, things like that. Is that kind of the main distinction between the two?
Um, I would say it's one and the same, to be honest. I think like when we're looking at health from a broad sense, and this is more of like what I work on now type of thing. So I assume we'll get there. We might get there. But health is sort of basically activity, like exercise, and that's sort of really general in a broad sense. It could be a walk, it could be sports, right? These are maybe the two different, or like even just getting up out of bed, um, type of thing after working in hospital. I think we'll dive into it, but to sports, which is really high performance. So that's activity, but around that is also a bunch of other things like sleep and recovery, nutrition, and stress even, right? So you have mental health, social health. It's fascinating how sort of like deep and vast and wide it is, the more you learn about it. But I think kinesiology is that activity bit, right? When we're really looking into physical health, and I think it mends together perfectly fine. I wouldn't see them as like two separate things.
Okay, yeah, that's great to know. I have a great time on this podcast, figuring out different things, and I love learning more about different disciplines, things like that. And something that I always ask is, you mentioned that York really advertised their program a little bit differently. Were there other schools that you applied to, and like I guess was York always the number one choice for you?
No, but to be honest, so I applied to U of T, applied to UTSC for like a life science thing. I applied to Waterloo. I think also there's also kinesiology, and I applied to Ryerson as a backup. I think their business program, because I remember the cutoffs were like low, or like they would accept a lot of people. Not to say it wasn't a great program, like from what I've heard, but I was like, oh, like I'll do business maybe, like everyone does business. That's where money is, right? So I chose York mostly because of financially. I think being able to stay at home and commute, you save a lot of money. Um, I wasn't too interested in that party life anyways, so I was just like, you know what, like just commute. And to be honest, the cutoffs for York were also pretty low, right? Or sorry, like it was pretty almost like easier to get into, especially if you came from PET, where everything was pretty like high performance in terms of academic, right? You stand out. So I think what was great about that was that you be a big fish in a small pond, opposed to like a small fish in a big pond, which is like a lot of U of T and like Waterloo. Not to say that it's not a good thing to have that healthy competition, but like you stand out a little bit more as a result of that.
Mhm. So at what point during your 4 years did you realize that you wanted to pursue further education?
Yeah, so I think it was in year two. So after year two, right? Like I said, you become a big fish in a small pond. Like PET just absolutely like it's almost ruthless where like they kind of like drill you and then make sure you really know your stuff to get good grades. So I did well in my first 2 years, right? And if I've listened to the Justin podcast, he might have talked about this too. But like both of us crushed it in our like first 2 years type of thing. Because he and I we went to school together. We did like a lot of our courses and things together. It was a great time. Um, we so I ended up doing really well, and in that second year, there was like specialist tracks that you can sort of go into. One of them was like health and fitness. I don't remember. There was like one other one, and then the one I went into was athletic therapy, right? Which was almost a separate program that you had to apply to. I went into this sort of like being like, oh, okay, cool is athletes. I'm like, cool. I'm an athlete, but I'll never make it anywhere. But it'd be really cool to work with some. And my thoughts were, oh, like I could be paid to stand on a sideline and watch sports. I'm like, I would watch sports for free. So like, this sounds like a great deal, right? And to work with them, up, apart from all the other things that you do to help them.
Yeah.
I think essentially during that time, I realized, oh, like athletic therapy is great, um, but it's very niche in terms of it's about athletes and their performance almost even, and rehab and performance, but it doesn't give you a broad enough sense of like health in general, right? I think you had to really zoom out from that um, to really understand from a broader context, like people, relationships, health, social health, mental health, all those type of
Mhm.
things.
Right.
Um, so it was during that time I think I was just like, oh, I'm getting a lot of good skills, but I need more. I need to learn more. I need to understand more to be able to help people more effectively.
Mhm. Yeah, great story. I'm very interested in the, you said standing on the sidelines. I would do the same thing. I love watching sports. What do you have, like, what were some standout experiences for them? I saw you had some experience, helping with different teams. Can you tell us about those experiences?
Yeah, man. I think so in that program they really throw you in the deep end. They're just like, here's a, because university athletes are semi-professional. They technically get paid because they're on scholarship, like most of them. Um, Here's a semi-pro team. Go and figure out what they need and like help them out with it. And they did that from year one, and mostly because I was on placement at U of T actually. Okay. So I think that was really good in a sense, where it's just like you really get your feet wet, you really go and learn. They've revamped the program since. I don't think they do that anymore, to be honest. Um, I think if I were to think about the highlights or what I learned, would just be like how little I know. And I think that's typically what you learn when you first start something. It's like how little you know about it. And it really humbles you because you're like, oh, you walk in with a lot of confidence and you're like, I can do this. I've learned this from the textbook. I've learned this from this course. But you go and you're like, what do I do? And you're like, I have no idea. Like, this is not how it's supposed to go, according to the textbook. So I think that's the biggest takeaway I had from any of those experiences throughout the 3 years, right? Not even just that first year. It was just um, understanding like, oh man, this is a very um, wide, very broad sort of field that you're sort of getting into.
Mhm. Yeah, and you talked a little bit before about, the different, like, the spectrum of health. There's, like, professional athletes, and there's people who are, being able to get out of bed is a good day for them, right? And the athletes that you work with, some of them are like freaks of nature, right?
Yeah.
So you're definitely like working with, the very far end of the spectrum, right? And yeah, so I guess you kind of mentioned that experience kind of propelled you into doing further education, right? So when it came to applying, what was the story of how you ended up in the UK, studying abroad?
Yeah. So I love this story because I graduated in 2020. So this is like peak COVID, right? So it was um, March 2020. We all remember it. Um, I I think I was on a bus back, to be honest, from some sort of trip or something. And then it was from a hockey game. We were in Buffalo. We're coming back. We've already crossed the border and everything. And then we get the messages about first it was York women's hockey uh, has canceled their game. And then I think like we're just like, oh, okay, like, this is a serious thing now. It's kind of coming over. I'll spare you the long story, but like essentially what happened was COVID happened. I graduated. We did the rest of that last little bit online, and then I wasn't able to get certified. So I was just like, what do I do with my time? And like everyone else, I played on the Nintendo Switch for about a good 2 or 3 months. Beat Fire Emblem a bunch of times, and yeah, it was a good time, but I was also like, oh man, like this kind of sucks because like we're all supposed to be looking for jobs now and things like that. I, like I said from like a minute ago, realizing how little I knew, even when I graduated, I was like, man, there's so much I don't know, right? And the biggest gap in my knowledge that I thought was at the time was that end stage of rehab. So, hey, maybe when you have an injury, I can manage you up to a certain point to get you back to that same point. But, that's the point that you got injured at as well. So it's one of those like, are you at an optimal level of health, right? And really, the World Health Organization, I remember this because I was doing it yesterday. World Health Organization definition of rehab is optimizing function. In an individual for their environment. And to optimize that for an athlete would be to get them stronger, get them better, and get them past that point that they're injured in, right? Um, whether it was a chronic injury, whether it was like an acute injury, right? I think bringing them past that point of now you're healthy was really important for me. All this to say, I did a bunch of online internships that were only offered online because of COVID, with fabulous, absolutely like incredible clinicians all over the world type of thing. E3 Rehab was one of them. These guys are sort of on, I think, the West Coast Level Up initiative. This was about health being a little bit broader, and then a strength and conditioning internship with Brock University. So the guys there are absolutely phenomenal. And really, it just, all this to say, I went down that path of strength and conditioning a little bit to understand a little bit more about how to now bring that athlete towards performance, right? And also it goes hand in hand in like injury prevention is my belief. So I think at the same time, finishing those internships, I was like, great, let me get a job. It was still COVID, obviously, so I was like, just volunteering. So I was just like looking out for where I might be able to volunteer or like figure out how I can sort of get some reps under my belt. And I saw someone, it was someone I used to lifeguard with, post on their story that they're at like a gym, right? And I was like, oh, like this looks great, right? It looks like a high performance facility. I'm like, I have no idea how it's open right now, but like, so I messaged her about it, right? Shout out to May. Messaged her about it. She knew the owner, and the owner had recently reopened because they're a sport injury clinic, right? With a emphasis on strength conditioning. I'm like, perfect. This is exactly sort of that direction I want to go in. So I don't know. I made the ask. I think that's one of the things I've learned this year is to make that ask. Just be like, oh, like, is there any chance they have an internship? Is there any chance that they have room for a volunteer, for someone to come in to just like shadow or like do whatever? And like surprisingly, what happened was like, yeah, come in, meet us and all that. And really the rest is history from that. For those next 2 years was volunteered with them, shadowed, almost like prove my worth type of thing, but also just like was curious about what it is I can learn. And eventually they hired me. There was another 2015 grad there that you might want to talk to as well that I'll point out later. But yeah, the next few years were great. I still felt like, hey, I don't have enough perspective, right? Like, I still know a lot about a little thing now, but I think sometimes to zoom out, you kind of realize, oh, that's how much more I don't know. So I think throughout those years, I was like applying to physio school, sort of on and off type of thing. But then after the first year and a half, I was like, no, I think I need this to just get a broader sense of healthcare and broader sense of how to help people, right? So I applied. I applied to Ontario University as well. Absolutely, like so hard to get into. Like I don't know if you've spoken to anyone else about it, but so hard to get into. Such a limited number of spaces and sort of different criteria, right? I'm not sure, right? Maybe I'm just not smart enough to get like a 4.0 in York University to like get into those universities. So I went overseas. They were pretty happy to have me. I think you can apply up to 5 for free, which was great. I was like, you can apply for free, like. So yeah, I chose Manchester because I knew one of my coworkers at the time is from Manchester. He loves it. He raves about it, and it's not London. London is just expensive. It's like Toronto rent prices. So I think without going in too in depth, sort of down that track, it was understanding that I needed a bit more perspective and understanding that I only know a little bit or, maybe even a lot about a little thing, but to get perspective on healthcare in general, that's why I sort of went into postgrad. Long story, but
yeah. No, I really like that, the humility, I guess, that comes with it. I think sometimes it might be easy to say, I think I know everything after doing these 4 years, but really, I think we spend our whole lives learning about different things. And speaking on those learning points, what was the biggest learning from your time in Manchester? Whether it be inside the classroom, outside the classroom.
I think it's still the same thing, and it's still something that I'm learning to this day, is just like continuing to have that perspective um really allows you to like take a step back, have the space to understand what direction you want to go in, right? When you don't have that perspective, all you know is this one tunnel, and all you know is this one direction, right? So even sort of like what you're doing now with like just talking to people, like building these relationships and sort of understanding maybe a little bit more about a certain field, um, I think that's the best way to understand what you really want, right? And then you can sort of choose and go down that path. I don't know if that's a really succinct answer for you, but
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm glad you touched on that. I really do enjoy learning about different things, and I'm glad that you do too as well. So now you've started your own business dealing with physio and rehab, that kind of thing, rehabilitating athletes back to even better than where they were before, right? How did you always know you wanted to start your own shop, or like was it kind of something later? How did you decide on that?
yeah, like that's another good question. Where did it start? I didn't think I would be sort of in the position I'm in, to be honest, at this point. I thought I would be, um, and nothing ever goes as planned. I think that's a big lesson. So I always knew that I wanted to provide very high quality care. I think that's what I'll start with. And I knew, um, even when I was it's called PETHS Alumni in Richmond Hill, that I worked for. Even when I was there, I was like, oh, like we are providing really good high quality care. I think it can be better. Not in like a very arrogant way, but like, oh, like, there are certain things that I think we're limited by, right? And that we can essentially not like, I don't want to be a glorified personal trainer, which is a lot what a lot of physios almost end up being, right? Um, Not in a bad way, but like I think personal trainers are great.
Yeah.
Um, so I wanted to provide high quality care, and I wanted to make sure that when people are accessing my expertise, um, I can really provide that. And one of the barriers I found was that oftentimes you are stuck repeating the very simple, basic things, um, like, and it's because that's important. So things like, hey, you need to get you need to be moving, you need to be active like throughout the week, right? It's not just like one day you go to the gym and then that's your activity for the week, right? Things like, hey, like you need to get, at least 7 hours, 8 hours of sleep for a good recovery. Things like, oh, like, you know, eating a balanced meal, protein, things like managing your stress. Like I said, these big pillars of health, like, yeah, they're important, but I think everyone might know that on a sort of a basic level. It's like, okay, I've heard this before, right? But yeah, I found myself telling them a lot of that because it's just like, yeah, you know this, but like we need to implement it, right?
Mhm.
So for me, working online and creating my own business is creating a model where I can deliver this, but not have to spend 5-10 minutes with everyone every single time to talk about this and why it's important. Instead, I can spend those 5-10 minutes talking about how they can implement in their lives, what challenges they might be going through to help them overcome the barrier to execution, right? And also just to be there in their corner and understanding, like, oh, yeah, of course it's going to be hard for you to sleep 7 hours when you've got XYZ, you've got blah, blah, blah. Of course, it's going to be hard for you to eat when, you know, you're now living alone and you have to choose all your meals and all those things, right? So
Mhm.
I'd rather spend the time doing those and helping them individually and what's difficult for them than like that time educating. Um, I can record that. I record that. That's a lot of the work I do. And even with those recordings, I'm like, I can dive into a little bit of the nuance for my niche, which is recreational athletes.
Mhm.
So
So yeah,
Yeah, sorry. Just to sum up, I think
Yeah.
for me, having my own business is a way for me to really design and just be as like deliver a lot of value in the way that I want it, to practice ethically, and to have a life design. And I'll let you ask your question, but that's something I think is the biggest part of business. Go on.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about ethics, because something I've been kind of dealing with healthcare is that inherently, if you, let's say you provide such amazing service to them that they don't come back for business, inherently that raises an ethics question, right? So I'm glad you raised that question, and I'm sure it's something that needs to be dealt with, and I'm sure you do a great job of that. And I'm curious about, you mentioned that people have this knowledge of what they need to do. They have this knowledge that sleeping is good for them, eating healthy is good for them, but it's just the difficulty putting it into action. How do you kind of bridge that gap and persuade people to take that action?
Absolutely. And it's a good question, because I guess if you look at, and the great thing about healthcare is revenue also equals to the amount of people you've helped, right? The more people you help, the more money you make, which is like one of the industries where like this is absolutely brilliant. I can help people and I can make more money. Like it's correlated. So your question is how I help them, right?
Mhm.
So you're asking about my business now.
Mhm.
Essentially, what I do is I call it rehab coaching, pretty much, right? A coach sort of comes with you, it's with you every step of the way, right? They're with you. They can help you understand the barriers. They empathize with your situation. They sort of have a good deep understanding of like, oh, like this is why it's difficult. And they keep you accountable. I think that's sometimes that's what my clients are only looking for. It's just like, I just want someone to check on me, and I think that goes a long way, right? I have my own business coaches and they keep me going, and I think coaching is for everyone. I think if we think about it from a broader sense, we have coaches all our life. Our parents from when we're born, they keep you accountable. They, nag you or whatever, but essentially they are keeping you accountable. And then you can build habits. Like if they didn't nag me to brush my teeth when I was young, I wouldn't have developed this habit, right? So in the same way, you go to school, you've got teachers who are now checking your homework. I think all your life you have a coach, right? Um, and then at some point you're like in the workforce, you have maybe supervisors. At some point they're like sort of expecting you to figure out all on your own, um, in certain aspects of your life, right? So I guess what I'm saying is I keep them accountable. I help them develop these habits and I help point them in the right direction, right? So I don't want them to, you know, and a big thing, a big pillar of mine is like missing, was it? I can't remember it now. Missing the forest for the trees, which is like, oh, you're focusing on the wrong thing, right? And that's where that expertise kind of comes in, that's right. So making sure they're focused on the right thing. You develop that rapport and trust with a certain person, so they know that if you're checking on them, it's more a place out of love and about out of like, hey, I just really want us to get to these goals, and we've sort of chatted about why it's important for you to develop these habits, right?
Mhm.
So, and then education, right? I think the education part doesn't work without that accountability and doesn't work without that habit building, right? Um, and yeah, I think the last thing would also just be to that coaching bit is to modify it to meet them where they're at.
Mhm.
Telling someone to walk 10,000 steps in a day is not very possible for an office worker who averages about 700 a day. I think a more reasonable step would be, let's get to 1,500 or something, and that's doubling like what they're doing. So I
Mhm.
think finding where they're at and then building it from a small habit, right? I think that's the main thing. I don't know if that answers your question,
Yeah,
Nathan,
yeah.
but
I'm glad you talked about accountability was one thing. Coaching, having like role models, someone to keep you accountable. For example, people like going to the gym together,
yeah,
because that keeps them accountable. And I talked about building small habits. And another theme that we talk about in this podcast is like the sacrifice, right? Like sometimes you have to sacrifice, playing video games until midnight in order to get that sleep, right? Or sacrificing eating, something that is unhealthy for eating something a little bit healthier. And I think that applies to tons of things, right? Whether it's school, relationships, things like that. You make sacrifices for what's important. And without giving away too much like personal information, what's kind of been like one of the highlights of running your business? Was there like a specific case that you had, or just generally seeing people get better?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I were to answer that and also added a thing to the last question, it would just be celebrating these small wins. I don't know if you relate to this, but like as a Asian Canadian person, we always reach a certain thing or get to a certain place and we're like, what's next? Instead of like taking that time to really like reward ourselves for, hey, it's called graft in the UK. I've really worked hard for this, right? And this is where I want to be, and I've got there. And then now I'm looking, what's next? What's next? What's next? So I think the biggest thing is to celebrate these small wins. So we do it all the time with my clients, right? Every week we're like, hey, what's a win that you've had today, right? Or this week, like, and it could be very simple things, but you'd be surprised at what people come up with. It's just like, oh, I got to my goal of 7,000 steps average or whatever, right? I think honestly, I get highlights all the time. I'm like, oh, like this is great. They're all doing great. They're all, getting better and things like that. If I were to think about one, let's think. I don't know if you saw recently, I think one of my athletes sort of returned to playing football, soccer for us. And I was able to sort of go to the practice because he's one of the guys that I did play with before he was sort of injured. So just being there and playing with him again, being on the same field, and like seeing him not really have missed a step. He scored a hat trick. He scored 3 goals like on his return, right? Not missing a step in terms of his like physical condition, but also like playing free, confidently, and like also not having that pain that he had before. I think that's one of the highlights for me, for sure.
So yeah, I'm glad you have these stories. I think like a big criticism of like business, at least what I'm used to, is that you don't really like help anyone. Whereas I really admire people who work in healthcare because they really help people, and like it's like really tangible on how they help people. And something you mentioned is like the relativity of like your goals, right? Like I think especially with social media, it's easy to say, oh, like I only bench press like 1 plate when I see guys on social media bench pressing like 4 plates, right? So I think that's super important that you need to have your own goals and things like that. And speaking of goals, do you have any future aspirations we can look forward to seeing from you, whether it be in business, schooling, traveling, volunteering, anything like that?
Yeah, I guess really the goal is because most of my model is mostly done online, right? Um, it's 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 a new thing. Like people aren't used to it. So I think the goal with that, and I think looping back to what I said earlier about life design, and it's about business is about designing your life. You don't want to be your own worst boss. A lot of people do fall into that, right? But really, business is for the freedom, one to again ethically decide like what it is that you're doing and healthcare, you're helping people, but also to this goes back to sort of taking care of yourself first. And that's life design for me, which is being able to go to the gym, being able to have that time to one, build healthy habits on my own, so that you can show up for other people. So people in your life, like your family, like your clients that you have a strong relationship with, or even just like your friends and things like that. So having that time and not being like, oh, I've got to work on XYZ, right? I don't think that's what business is about. People have this like hustle culture of like, oh, business is about like, getting down and like being busy and like things like that. I'm like, yeah, at this point right now, yes, I get it, right? But also having that very strict boundary on business so that you can show up in your personal life, right? You don't want it to leak over. So that's the main goal for me. It's still something I work on daily, but like the life design in general is to be mobile, right? I can be here. I'm working right now, or like I was working earlier this morning because I'm still a bit jet lagged. I woke up at 6 a.m. So I was like, oh, I might as well just get some work done, type of thing. Move some stuff around because later on I'm gonna be hanging out with my sister. Like we're going to the Raptors game. I know you guys went to the Raptors game.
Nice. Yeah, very cool.
So, I'm just like, oh, like being able to show up and be present for my sister when we have that time together. Being able to show up for myself in terms of my health and traveling. I love to travel. So it's like, oh, that's part of my life design. I can travel and I can work at the same time, right? It doesn't have to be like taking time off work and not helping people while I'm traveling.
Right.
So those are the goals really. It's just to continue on doing that. I think for me, I'm trying to live that right now, and it's always a process. There's a lot to learn, but that's the ultimate goal. That's the ideal, like having that very clear distinction between work and being present for people and time, and even when I'm playing sports type of thing, and not thinking about business at that time.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the life design. I think that's the goal. The life design.
Yeah, I think that's huge. You talked about even when you're helping your clients is that holistic view, right? Like not sacrificing one area for another, and kind of looking at health as, mental health, physical health, emotional health. All those things are super important. And I think that's a great takeaway, at least from what I've learned today. So thank you for those insights. Before we close, just have a few more questions for you. If we were to come back to you in, let's say, 10 years, and we were to say Wesley is, and there's a blank, like what is it that you want to be like known for? What do you want your legacy to be?
Honestly, I might just go with one word. I think like human, right? I think especially when we're talking about online marketing, online commerce, online, everything's going online now. AI is taken over, right? I think the biggest thing is just to continue to be human, continue to be genuine, continue to, show up for people, right? Because an AI can't empathize with you. They can't understand that, oh, you didn't do your workout because your grandmother passed away. Like, and I think that's heavy and that's deep. Right. So yeah, I think that's the one word I go with.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, especially, a huge trend is AI. So I'm glad you kind of tied that in there. And I'm glad, that's something that you work for when you're working with these clients, right? Because there is that psychological aspect that we talked about, and it's not as easy sometimes just following a workout plan, right? So I'm definitely glad that you're able to see that for your clients as well. And last question for you, you mentioned before that you know a lot of fellow PET grads, and sometimes you've fallen out of touch with them, but is there any other PET grads that you'd like to see on this podcast?
Honestly, like I like to see all of them. I like to see all of 2015. But like let me think. Someone that would be interesting is Jerry. I forgot his last name, to be honest, but we did music together. Absolutely phenomenal percussionist. Or Matthew Morales. He's my boy. And I think I don't know if you've seen his stuff on Instagram. He's crazy, man. So I think Matthew Morales, that would be a good one to get on this podcast. He's a great chat as well. Yeah, those two.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. All those insights about coaching, accountability, humility, understanding what you don't know is a huge thing. Celebrating the small victories was another thing you mentioned. So thank you very much for your time today, and thank you everyone so much for watching, and we'll see everyone next week. See you later.
No problem. Take care, guys.